chapter 4 of Speech to Print. We're going to look at the first section right now on pages 94 through 112. And we're going to look specifically at the structures of English orthography. So if you're following along, that down here at the bottom tells you what pages we're looking for. First of all, what is orthography? Well, orthography is the written system for our language. We have words that are created from sounds, and those sounds have been attached to letter and letter combinations. And so those letter combinations is what makes up our orthography. We know that if we have a high quality morphological understanding, then we have an easier time of connecting that to the orthographic representations. So in everyday language, that would mean if I have a good understanding of the sounds within my language and how to produce those sounds, then I will be able to attach those to the letters or letter groups that would represent them in our words. So in a word study program, then, we would need to make sure that we involve things such as the word origin and history of that word, because that will play a factor in what spelling combinations have been used and what the word means. We also need to know those basic phoneme to grapheme correspondences, so the one-to-one correspondence of what sound goes to what letter, the rules and constraints that come with what position that sound is in, because that might determine the letter combination we're going to use for that particular representation, so that placement of the sound in a word. We also have patterns and conventions for things in English. We have certain rules that we have to follow to where in an English word, certain sounds won't occur or certain patterns won't occur. That will alter, of course, when we bring in other words from other languages. For example, K and Z are never going to be a combination that you're going to use in English. We also want to make sure that this word study also involves morphology, bringing up those meaningful parts that have a unique meaning that are added to our word, or the word itself has a meaningful part that is going to have a spelling component to it. There's certain reasons why we use letters, because they might be connected to the base word, or they might be connected to a morphological unit later on. We'll see that a lot in chapter 5 when we start talking about more morphology in a little bit deeper of a way of why it's important. But morphology is an important component to our orthography. So a couple of vocabulary words we want to make sure we understand as we go through this chapter is orthography, of course, our writing system. We have the alphabetical principle, which deals with this idea that letters and letter combinations are going to represent our sounds. And then we have that process of storing the words in our memory to bring up that letter combination for the sound, that association, those patterns that we need quickly, based in our phoneme awareness. So that is your orthographic mapping. Then we have this idea of morphophonemic. English is very morphophonemic, which means that there are rules and pronunciations for certain word pieces in relationship to what they mean and the sound that they are going to represent. We have some sounds that can alter the complete meaning of a word, and we have words that will change just based on changing one sound. So that makes our language morphophonemic. For example, it is much different to be sleeping on a cot than a cat, and all I've done is just adjusted one phoneme, but the meaning has completely changed. This also applies to other places. Again, we'll look a little bit more in chapter 5, but I want you to be familiar with this idea of morphophonemic, that the rules and pronunciations of morphemes are in direct relationship with the phonology. So meaning plus sound. Then we have graphotactic and phonotactic. Now, an easy way to think of this is graphotactic is dealing with written grapho, and so placement of certain patterns by where they belong in the word, where that sound belongs in the word. Those are called position constraints. So there are going to be certain spelling patterns that we will not use at the beginning or the end, and vice versa. So think of graphotactic as the spelling guides, the spelling rules. The phonotactic are rules that come because of the sounds that follow each other. So because we have certain sounds in order to create our words, there are certain combinations that we will not use and certain combinations we will use. So when we're looking at spelling guides to help us determine which letters to use, there are graphotactic, positional constraints, and there are phonotactic, or sound constraints. Certain sounds are not going to be allowed to follow each other, therefore certain spellings are not going to follow each other. And that if you have a certain sound, you must have this kind of a spelling occur. A good example of that is TCH. You will have that ch sound being used at the end because it will have a short or laxed vowel in front of it. That's a phonotactic constraint. We'll go into a little more into that if it seems a little bit confusing right now. So our chapter goals for this whole chapter are going to be looking at the history of our writing system, look at how those Anglo-Saxon, Latin, French, and Greek influences changed our orthography and the way we spell things. We're going to practice mapping some common letter to sound correspondences, and we're going to look at several constraints and patterns on which letter groups we can use. Now, some of these we're familiar with because we use them all the time, but others I'm going to show you a resource that you can tap into to double check, oh, this is why we're going to use this letter grouping. Sometimes it's hard to remember all of them. We are also going to look at some syllables and some spelling of those syllables, what things to look for. This is verbal syllables, kind of tapping into chapter 3 and syllabication, so we'll look into a little bit of that. And then we're going to look at whether or not it's predictable to spell words, how English is not as confusing as you might agree or you might think. And then we'll look at some multilinguistic ways to approach that phonics instruction and spelling instruction to kind of back up what we've been talking about with structured literacy and all. All right, so for some fun, let's take a look at this little video about the origins of English and how it developed.
When we talk about English, we often think of it as a single language. But what do the dialects spoken in dozens of countries around the world have in common with each other, or with the writings of Chaucer? And how are any of them related to the strange words in Beowulf? The answer is that, like most languages, English has evolved through generations of speakers, undergoing major changes over time. By undoing these changes, we can trace the language from the present day back to its ancient roots. While modern English shares many similar words with Latin-derived Romance languages like French and Spanish, most of those words were not originally part of it. Instead, they started coming into the language with the Norman invasion of England in 1066. When the French-speaking Normans conquered England and became its ruling class, they brought their speech with them, adding a massive amount of French and Latin vocabulary to the English language previously spoken there. Today, we call that language Old English. This is the language of Beowulf. It probably doesn't look very familiar, but it might be more recognizable if you know some German. That's because Old English belongs to the Germanic language family, first brought to the British Isles in the 5th and 6th centuries by the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. The Germanic dialects they spoke would become known as Anglo-Saxon. Viking invaders in the 8th to 11th centuries added more borrowings from Old Norse into the mix. It may be hard to see the roots of modern English underneath all the words borrowed from French, Latin, Old Norse, and other languages.
So right off the bat, what we realize is that England, where English originated from, was a melting pot from the very get-go. So if we look at who was living on those islands before even that Germanic influence came in, you've got your Celtic dialects, you've got your Old English, so your Celtic and your Gaelic, which were established there first. With those German influences, the Anglos, the Saxons, the Jutes, they came and heavily influenced and heavily changed a lot of that Gaelic and Celtic, along with those Norse influences from the Vikings. Not as strong as the Anglos and the Saxons, but still present. That's why a lot of our English words and our base language sound very similar to a lot of German words, is because there is the same root there. Still getting meshed with the Gaelic and the Celtic, we get this Old English, which we call Anglo-Saxon. That's the base of our language. And then what we'll talk about a little later on is the influence of when that Latin came in, when that French came in, and when that Greek came in to create our modern day English. So something I thought was kind of fun was listening to what those different components sound like. So this video down here is going to go back to Anglo-Saxon, back to Old English, and let you hear some of the differences that evolved over time. And you may start to notice that some of the spellings that existed all the way back at the beginning have remained. So let's take a look about, would you be able to understand English the further back you go?
If you had a time machine, how far back could you go and still understand English? In the 19th and 18th centuries, you'd probably still be okay. This is from the book Robinson Crusoe in 1719.
I, poor miserable Robinson Crusoe, came on shore on this dismal, unfortunate island, which I called the Island of Despair.
That's fairly easy to understand, but you might struggle with slang like battyfang and kikarapoo. And now, your birthday suit actually is a suit that you wear on your birthday.
So a quick pause. This is something that's really funny as we talk about later in chapter 7 about vocabulary and how vocabulary alters our understanding, our comprehension. Is even back 20 years ago, we used words that we don't necessarily use in our modern speech now. So vocabulary is a huge alterator of the English language, but we're talking about sounds here and later on. So for the most part, you're going to understand a lot of what's happening in this text except for those vocabulary words.
The 1600s is the time of Shakespeare.
Thy natural magic and dire property, unwholesome life, usurp immediately.
Harder to follow, but not everyone speaks like that. You would hear plenty of words you didn't understand, though.
So we're getting more vocabulary discrepancy, but you're also getting a little bit of a sound change for some of those letters.
The bigger problem for you now is the pronunciation. The sound of the vowels has changed, and the accent is becoming much harder to understand. For example, T is pronounced Tay, and gone is pronounced gone. In the 1500s, people essentially speak like the Bible.
Now therefore, thus saith the Lord, Thou shalt not come down from that bed on which thou art gone up, but shalt surely die.
There are also hundreds of words that didn't mean a thing to you. Before about 1400, you'd hear Middle English, and you would hardly understand anything, written or spoken.
Juan dat April with his sure sorter, the drocht of March had perset to the rotor, and bathed every vein and switchly core of which were engendered his the floor.
So if you look at this one, you're going to notice some words that look familiar because we do have some spelling patterns that have remained. But that vowel shift, the further back we go, we're going to have more letter sound shifting in our pronunciation, which explains why some of the letter combinations have been kept because they represented that sound a little bit better.
If you went all the way back to 1000 AD, you'd hear Old English.
Fader ore, thuthe ton heavenum, sie thin noma your hallhood, tobe come thin riche, ye were the thin willow.
Now we're getting a little bit more into that Gaelic, and if you notice with earthe, that one had a different pronunciation. That word was actually earth, but we kept the spelling of E-A-R, but it was earth, where you had a little bit more of the E and the R on it. So you can see why when we go back to Old English, we get further away from our current pronunciation, but yet the spellings have remained. So we're going to go ahead and skip forward a little bit, and we're going to look at writing systems as a whole. So looking at a writing system based on meaning, you're dealing with things like pictographs. In the earliest languages, they would use a picture to represent an idea or a word. So you have things like Sumerian, you've got Chinese and Japanese that have evolved over time, where this is supposed to represent a person, this is a boy, this is you. A lot of these, like Zhong is middle, where you don't have each individual sound. And the only way that you can really learn this language is to memorize all of the different characters that represent ideas. Interesting enough, things like function words and connecting words don't really exist in these languages because they don't represent a concrete idea. In Chinese, if I was going to say, I want to meet you at 10 o'clock tomorrow, then you basically literally say, I tomorrow at 10 see you. So there isn't really a lot of connecting words there. But we also have writing systems based on sound, such as the Cherokee Nations is based on syllables. So you have each symbol represents a vowel and a consonant combination, which is a syllable. And then you have a hieroglyphics where they actually started with a pictographic, but then Reformed Egyptian brought in, well, this picture that used to represent an idea is now going to just represent a sound. And interesting enough, they didn't include vowels in their hieroglyphics. So you would have to try to fill in what you thought that missing vowel was based by the consonant combination, which is really hard when the ancient language goes away and nobody speaks it anymore. So there are some discrepancies in Egyptian to what that word actually was because the vowels are missing. They're only using consonants to represent. I thought it was rather kind of funny. Then you have pure alphabetic, like Arabic and like English, to where we have a symbol to represent a single phoneme, and you combine those together to blend them together to make a word.
So one of the interesting things about English is that it is morphophonemic, which means it is a combination of how these sounds are put together and the meaning in which we attach to it. So morphology, as we will learn later, is all about the smallest units of meaning. And phonemic, of course, is the smallest units of sound. Now, that comes into play because one particular change in a sound can change the entire meaning of a word. I know you have often heard me say it's easier to sleep on a cot than it is a cat. Those are entirely different things because we've only changed one phoneme, but the whole word has changed. This is important because morphology includes more than just the meaning. It also has the word origin and the word parts associated with it, and we attach that with our spelling and the sounds that are shifted or changed or adjusted to that for these words. So we're going to take a little fun clip of the spelling bee. If you've ever wondered how these kids are able to spell such massive amounts of words, I want you to pay attention to what he asks the judges. And then we're going to talk about what those pieces are that make his ability to spell these words possible. So let's take a look at this little guy.
Dev Shaw, if you spell this next word correctly, we will declare you the 2023 National Spelling Bee Champion. Samophile.
Samo meaning sand Greek.
Wait a second.
Samo meaning sand Greek.
Yes.
Phile meaning lover Greek.
You're on the right track.
Can I please have all the information?
Samophile is a noun from Greek. A samophile is an organism that prefers or thrives in sandy soils or areas.
Samophile, may you please have the sentence?
Any samophile, for example a cactus, would flourish in the Arizona desert. Can you say it for us?
Samophile, samophile.
Samophile.
P-S-A-M-O-P-H-I-L-E, samophile?
That is correct.
Now, I don't know about you, but I had never heard that word before in my life, let alone know some of the information that went around it. But he asked for the definition, he asked for the word parts, he asked for the origin, he asked it for use in a sentence, because all of those pieces are actually going to help him with some of the more complicated words. So our spelling predictability in English is not as haphazard as we tend to believe. There aren't as many irregulars or crazy occurrences as we tend to believe when we run across one. We have 50% of our language can be spelled with a phoneme to grapheme correspondence alone. I call that the one-to-one. If you hear the sound then you're going to represent that most likely with an M. If you hear the sound p, it's going to be represented with a P. Those are our one-to-one correspondences. So 50% of our language is going to be connected to that sound to grapheme connection, which makes it a lot easier. That's half of our language down. The next thing we have to consider is 36% of the additional words are going to have a rule or a spelling guide to associate with them. So that might be something like you'll use AY to represent the A sound when it occurs at the end of a word. Or you might use DGE to represent the J sound when it follows a short vowel. So these ones now get us to 86% of our language. We can grab 10% more of our words if we look at the word origin, the meaning, and the morphology. And that's what you notice that Dev Shah was asking, was for those pieces. So now we're at 96% of our language. Knowing what the spelling will be and the predictability is pretty high. That leaves us only with about 4% that are true oddities and the true irregulars that really have no rhyme or reason. So the idea behind our phonics instruction is to, yes, focus in on the sound and all those things that we talked about in chapters 3 and 2, but also explicitly connect the correspondences and the grapheme phoneme code. And that code includes those rules, the one-to-one correspondence, and the morphology piece of that. Of course, when we get to those true oddities, we're going to want to use the heart pattern approach or just give them some kind of maybe a little bit help guidance. There's not a lot, but it doesn't leave us with a lot of memorization to occur. Now, we need to remember from the previous slides that we're not teaching just one language, English. We're actually teaching the influence of at least 4. It's multi-layered, it may be complex, but we do have a structure and a phonology that goes with it, and that can be understood by our elementary school students.
Dev Shah, if you...
We don't need to watch him again. Sorry about that. So let's take a quick look at how that morphophonemic orthography does that combination of meaning and sound. So if you want to take a practice on this one, it is on exercise 38 in your workbook, and that workbook page is 97. So if I look at the word many, we've got m, e, n, e. So we have 4 phonemes, which we just transcribe it like this. So you see there's that slight nasal influence on the n. And the difference is that you're going to have a nasalization of the vowel. The vowel becomes whiny a little bit. And that's because of that phonemic influence of the n. So we want to explicitly show students, yes, when you have a nasalization of a vowel, you're going to have a slight difference in your pronunciation or your diction. Because your dialect is going to influence that. You'll see that in things like butter. We have the sounds represented, but because we go from a voiced vowel to a voiced vowel, our tongue will shift to that t to d in American forms, with there's a little bit of a schwa on there as well. This is kind of a kickback to chapter 3 when we're talking about those allophonic variations and how things change. So go ahead and pause if you want to try these on your own, and then you can go back and see, did you make that connection? Is there a difference between how it's spelled and what you might hear with some of that morphophonemic orthography coming into play? So if you paused and you did it, then you can go ahead and check the answers. They're also in the back of your book that you can also check the answers, what happens to some of these allophonic variations. To touch on a few, we have something like trinket. You see this in train, where you often, because of the movement of the mouth, you have the TR sounding a little bit like a ch. You have a nasalization of the I, and your final vowel can turn into a slight schwa. Trinket, it. It's like an it, there. And educate, because you have this D in between 2 vowel sounds, It often sounds a lot more like a J because we don't want to turn our voice off. And we actually have a little bit of an aspirated onto that k sound when we can educate. Just a little bit more air coming off of that one. So there's kind of a balance of teaching kids to pull apart the sounds, but don't pull them apart too much. Try to listen for that pure sound we were talking about in chapter 3. Moving on, let's go to those 4 languages that have influence. We talked a little bit about them earlier. We're going to go a little bit more in depth now. So we're going to identify and describe those influences on our writing. Now we have Anglo-Saxon, Norman Old French, Greek, and Latin. Let's start with the most common 100 everyday things. Our most common words are Anglo-Saxon. This is when you had that Greek and that Gaelic and that Celtic being influenced by the Vikings and the Germanic Jutes that came in, and we created Anglo-Saxon. Things to look for is they're often one syllable. They're going to have our vowel teams and our oddest spellings with our silent letters, our digraphs, and all of the 4% irregulars are coming from this Old English. And really the only reason I can offer up is because traditionally they'd been around for so long that they kept them. They weren't going to want to change them. You also are going to include our function words, which include most of our schwas occurring. So things like horse, wood, hot dog, heart, earth, that doesn't really follow a logic pattern. Those are all Anglo-Saxon. I think this is why English sometimes feels that it is confusing, even though the predictability is so high, 96% of our language, is because that 4% live in our 100 most common terms and phrases. So the kids encounter them early on. That's why the use of heart patterns becomes incredibly helpful, and why the use of spelling guides and spelling patterns must be taught early on, because it helps get rid of some of the ambiguity. Then we have the influence of the Norman French. These are going to be related, like when you hear them, oh, you can thank the French for that. Well, that's because they're food and fashion, social ideals and relationships, things like a cousin, democracy kind of thing. Well, democracy is Greek, but you get the idea through food and fashion mostly. You're going to end up with some features such as the soft C and G are French. You're going to have a spelling of OU to represent the U in soup. So that's where that one comes up. Even though it's rare, it doesn't occur a lot. That's where that spelling occurs or shows up, is because of the French. And then special endings like et, el, ik, ein, like unique, etiquette. Those are all coming from the French influence. Cousin, crouton, coupon, nouvelle. Those ones are all French-based words, and you can kind of have a certain feel to them. A good indication, again, is that food and fashion and relationships. Just helping, oh, that's a French influence. They're a little bit more strongly pronounced within our language. We have a lot more of the French influence than we do the others. Until you get to philosophical and academic language. In this realm of our language, we started having aristocrats traveling the continent, going to these French schools, having these upper level academic Greek and Latin classes that brought more of that language into everyday common use. But still, we find it predominantly in our academia world. So with the Greek, you're thinking philosophical, mathematical, and scientific. With the Latin, you're looking social and physical sciences, a lot of our academic words, and in literature. The way that we can help tell if they're kind of based in Greek is look for that PH standing for the F sound. That is a Greek-based word. That CH is going to represent K, and that Y is often an I sound, like psychology. The parts cannot be pulled apart. If you can use any of the morphological pieces in different areas, like prefix or suffix, then it's a Greek combining form. Latin parts definitely have a role, and they do not deviate from that role. So things like neuropsychology, biology, chlorophyll, decathlon, agnostic, these are all dealing with that scientific, mathematical, philosophical, and you can see some of those sounds come into play. Now, Latin doesn't have any sounds that help us distinguish between what they are, but they do have more multisyllables. They are formed from a root word,
And most of our prefixes and suffixes that we are used to, especially working with second and third grade, are going to be Latin based. We don't do a lot of Greek combining forms in those younger grades. So things like deception, paternal, aquarium, solar, those ones are all Latin. If you don't really hear some of these sounds that you hear from Greek, then most likely it's going to be Latin. And when I'm trying to distinguish if this is a Latin-based root or a Greek word or a Greek-based word, I always kind of default to it's probably Latin first unless I hear some of these things. And don't worry, sometimes it is hard to tell. Now, something fun about how these sounds can help us differentiate word origin is let's take CH for a minute. CH is a spelling pattern that we use in 3 of these different languages. It is used in a CH in French words, but it's going to make a sh sound. So that is something we teach students, is that if this is a French-based word and you hear the sh sound, it's not going to be SH. They don't use SH for that in French. They use CH. If you hear a k sound and it's a Greek-based word, then you're going to want to do a CH for that k sound. The only time we're going to use that ch is if it's an Anglo-Saxon base word. So you can see how this would be important to let kids know how to identify what origin it's from, or you might just tell them, and that will help them to learn those. So let's practice deciding if some of these words are Anglo-Saxon, Norman French, Latin, or Greek. Since we're going to try to help our kids do that, let's see how well we can do that. This is exercise 39 on page 98 of your workbook. So if I took the first one, sophisticated, what do we think it is? Well, right away, I hear that PH as a F sound. So I know that, I didn't start with that one. I know that sophisticated would be over in the Greek column. Looks like I started with risque. So why would risque be French? Well, you've got that unique ending, and that fits with the French endings. What about provocative? Right away, you see a suffix of TIVE and a prefix of PRO. Voc, VOC is the root, and then this A is something we call an additive for ease of pronunciation. And that's something we add to a Latin root in order to have it blend nicely with our way our mouth moves into its suffix. So this is something kind of fun to go through and think, well, which one of these are going to fall? Go ahead and pause the video if you want to do that activity and give yourself some practice, and then turn it back on in a few minutes to check your answers. Okay, so anybody who paused, you paused and started again. Anybody who didn't, just wanted to see answers, that's okay. You might pause it at any time and think, well, maybe I need to see a few more examples. So, instruction, again, in is our prefix, struct is our root, and shun is our suffix, so that would be a Latin-based word. I can never say this one. Takesis, I can never say that one. And the only reason I know it's going to be a k is because that CH is Greek, and it's going to be a k sound. So katesis, again, out of my usage world, so it's harder for me to remember how that's said. Then you have physique is French. If you said it was because you have this QUE, you are correct. And physique is not really fuzzy, it's more like a V sound. So it's not quite Greek for that one. Now take a look and see how you did. If you have any questions, make sure to ask me why something was organized. If you can't tell right away because of those rules that we talked about on the previous page of why they're like that. Now, this is just the base of our language. Some of you might be saying, what about karate or things like that? Especially as we start talking about different spelling rules, which we're going to do here in a little bit. You're going to notice that there are some quote unquote words that do not follow that spelling guide. Again, this is why we need to let them know where the word is from, because we borrow words from other languages all the time. The guidelines that we're going to offer up here in a little bit are for English words. So if you have words like cello or barbecue or chocolate, remember those don't come from our base English words. Those are words that we have borrowed or taken from other languages. And that follows different rules. Okay, so we know that we can construct words by their word parts. Here's another activity, kind of going back to that morphophonemic. Some of the word parts we combine naturally, and we don't usually cross over base languages. Like we won't usually take an Anglo-Saxon word part and join it with a Greek word part. We tend not to do that. Remember, with Latin, everyone has a certain order. You don't interchange the two. Greek can tend to be any order that makes a word that they like. So for example, if I took touch and down, that's going to make our Anglo-Saxon compound word. Things like uptown, back up, touch back. But if I take the shun and the cons and the Ds, take these word parts, this is what I would have for my Latin combinations. And then of course that leaves me with my ologies, my phonos, and my geos for the Greek-based. Okay? It's just some fun way to build what you can build. Students really find word matrices helpful when they're kind of trying to construct those, especially with Latin, and it also helps with Anglo-Saxon, because you read it from left to right and you have your prefixes all in yellow, your root is the blue in the middle, and your suffixes are red on the other side. And you just go left to right and you can choose one. So I can choose re and sa, or I could choose re, a sign, and then an ending if I want to. And you just kind of keep moving across. The only thing you're not going to do is to go down and keep combining, like reassignolded. You're not going to do that. But each of these word parts can help give you a definition that builds to the overall definition for the new word. We'll talk a little bit more about that in chapter 5. All right. So now we looked at kind of how our language is organized, how it was built, some influences that changed some of the spelling patterns. Let's talk about how to build that ability in our students to map out those phoneme grapheme correspondences, things we need to pay attention to, definitions we need to know, and then how do I help give them mastery practice in building these words, since there's so much influencing it and it can feel crazy and overwhelming. Well, we're going to tie to the sound walls and we're going to tie to the phoneme grapheme correspondences. So we need to make sure that everyone's on the same page with what the terminologies are, such as a laxed vowel is when you have your relaxed vocal cords. Traditionally, it's called a short vowel, has no connection to how it's actually made. It went to actually the way they spelt it before they standardized, and it was really kind of annoying. Then you have the tense vowel, which of course have your tense vocal cords and your mouth is tight. So long vowels are going to be tight. Students need to understand the difference and feel the difference because we have different rules that go with laxed vowels and different rules that go with tense vowels. Let's see, I think another one I wanted to point out was diphthongs. And diphthongs, as we know from chapter 2, they glide through many parts of the vowel valley, and we want to make sure that students understand and know that. Okay, so we're going to utilize the sound spelling cards with our sound wall, and then we're going to map out what the representation is between sound and spelling. Now, this was at the beginning of chapter 4. Why do we have the spellings that we do? Well, you can thank Samuel Johnson for that in 1755. He felt a need to standardize the spelling. And so he made the first standardized modern English dictionary in Oxford. And he did it for the sole purpose of standardizing the spelling, since as he traveled around England and all of the colonies, there were various ways to spell depending on your education level. And so the dictionary was actually created not to give us definitions, but to standardize the spelling. So it's really funny because his first initial one was like a little bit of dry humor, such as dull was defined as not exhilarating, not delightful, as to make dictionaries is dull work, which I kind of laughed because I'm like, that's what you're doing. Now, in 1755, this dictionary was published as the first Oxford English Dictionary and was utilized in schools and in tutoring to standardize spelling. So you could tell if you were an educated individual because you would use the standard. In 1776, something was happening across the ocean, and where they had been using this dictionary for 20 years, At 1776, they decided we are going to not do anything or use anything that the British have produced because we are independent. And Noah Webster set about the task to create his first American English dictionary. And when he did that, he took a lot of the spellings that Samuel Johnson had created and standardized and put several of them back into a phonetic one-to-one correspondence. I know modern teachers wish they could go back in time and say, hey, Noah, why didn't you do that with everything? I can't answer that. I have the same question myself. So just remember, some of those things were changed for the American English Dictionary. That's why some of our spellings are different than the English one. But tradition still reigns supreme on some of them. So let's get to practicing some of that. So I like to do this phoneme graphing mapping or this orthographic mapping with Elkonin boxes and their sound spelling cards, listed in a way that teaches them not only position rules for those spelling patterns, but also any phonological rules that come in, like certain sounds cannot follow. I think it's also important that you teach them order of frequency that you might see some of these spellings. A lot of sound spelling cards will list them with the first top options being marked as more popular, or they'll give you a phonological guide with some like these red squares. I do think it's very important, especially as you're introducing more and more spellings for these sounds, that you give them those guides of, does position matter, of where you hear the sound, does what you hear coming after the sound or before the sound matter, and then how often does this actually occur, so they can kind of decide what their first choice is, their second choice is, as they're making decisions on what's being spelled what. The other nice thing about that is you do want them to take a minute and look at what they wrote and ask themselves, is this making sense to my grade level brain? We do that as adults all the time. Does that look right? So there is a little bit of a guess and check at the end, but it's more of an educated process than it is just randomly guessing what they think. So let's try one. Let's do our first one. This is the routine that I would use to help them map out these sounds and to encode. We would start by saying the word, and then we're going to use the word in a sentence, and then we're going to count the sounds out. So I'm going to pretend to do this with you right now, and then pay attention to the steps in which we use this building of the word. So the first word is stop. What's the word? Stop. I would like to stop the ball from rolling down the hill. So the word was stop. Then we're going to count the sounds out. Ready? Stop. I forgot the order. Apologize for that one. So let's count the sounds out. S, t, a, p. I have marked one square for each sound because these are going to represent the sounds. We're going to put the spelling pattern in each box. These are sound boxes. So then I would say the first sound we said was S. How do we want to represent that sound? We're going to pop over and we think our first choice is an S. So yes, we're going to use an S to represent that S sound at the beginning. Our second sound was T. How do we want to represent that T sound? Our first choice is a T. Let's use a T. So you can see why that 50% of our language one-on-one correspondence is so important, because most of the time it's going to be that one-to-one. Our next sound was ah. Let's go down to our octopus. That's going to be represented with an O. And our last sound was P. We're going to represent that with a P. Good job. So boys and girls, what we're going to do now is we're going to do a sound check. We're going to touch each sound and make sure we have each sound represented with what we want it to represent. So S, T, A, P. The word is stop. Or read it again. Stop. Our word was stop. So embedded in this encoding, I'm doing a sound check, which is a sound by sound blend. I'm going to continuously blend and then read it twice. I then would say, boys and girls, all sounds are represented. Let's spell stop. S-T-O-P spells stop. Nice job. We would check it, erase, and go again. So our second one would be bake. The word is bake. What's the word? Bake. I like to bake a cake. Let's count our sounds. B,
A, k. We have 3 sounds. We're going to represent 3 boxes. And let's start with our first sound. Our first sound is B. We're going to use and B. Our second sound is A. I should have split these up. The A is going to be represented by an A consonant E. I've seen this done a couple ways where they'll write the E outside the box. Don't put an A/E inside this box because that's going to mess them up thinking the A and the E are together. And then our last sound is a K. So we're going to do a sound check. B, A, K. Let's blend it. Bake. Our word is bake. What was our word? Bake. Let's spell it. You spell bake, B-A-K-E. So you can do this with all of your words. The next word would be church. So you can see how we're going to have ch. It's a C represented with a CH. A is going to be U-R and a CH again. So put both letters within the box. When you're teaching this one, you talk about how U-R is more commonly used for the sound in the middle. Please make sure that you are differentiating between the vowel R, and the consonant R sound. Consonant R, as we talked about in chapter 2, is a whistled mouth. Put your mouth in a whistle form, make it tight, put your tongue in the middle of your mouth, and push it out as R. That is a lot different than Er. Is open wide with your teeth, your tongue flat between your teeth. And that's a big difference. And the most common way to spell in the middle actually is U-R. And those would be one of those positional and frequency traits that we would teach them. You can also do this with multisyllabic words, as in rabbit. You can count out how many sounds in rabbit and then take each sound. And when you get to that B, just put double B inside the box. When you do it on this rewrite, you can show them where the syllable break is if you're ready for that, or you can just write it out as it normally is. Okay? So if we're going to orthographically map, it requires that we know how to say the word, how to segment the word into phonemes, and then how those graphemes are used, how those letters are used in conjunction. There is on the folder that I shared with everyone a routine card that takes you through a script for this, so you can help keep all the pieces in order and then pull yourself away so students answer more directly. So let's practice a little bit more with some of these others. Now, I cheated for you. I gave you the sound boxes and how many sound boxes they are, but the rest of it, you get to decide what letter pattern is going to represent that sound. For example, with na, we have 2 sounds. The first sound is going to be n, represented with GN. This is a German-based word in Anglo-Saxon, and they used to pronounce the G. The also thing you can tell them is when it's German-based and it has to do with the teeth or biting, it's going to use that silent GN. And then we have the ah, that back ah sound being represented by AW, and AW is most likely used at the end for that back ah sound. How about the word enough? That has 4 sounds. Where are you going to put your letter combinations? I guess I did ought. Never mind. Sorry. Ought is next. That has 2. So ah is the first sound. That's how we're going to represent it. And t. What about stretch? It has 5 sounds. How are you going to represent each one of those sounds? If you did s, t, ch, you are correct. And it's using a TCH because the sound in front of it must be a relaxed or short vowel. That's again why position and phoneme sound in front play an important role when we're teaching this code. It's kind of fun to sit there and remember what you can remember or not. So go ahead and pause, try out the rest of them, and then come back and see how you did. Welcome back. If you didn't pause, thanks for sticking around. So let's do enough. 4 sounds. This is one of the reasons why we did some of that phoneme counting in chapter 2. It's because we need to make sure we can identify each one of the sounds so we can segment. We have E, N, A, F. So we have 4 sounds. E, N, A is going to be OU, and F is actually the GH. Chiffon, which is our French-based word, tells the kids, oh, that sh, if it's French, it's going to then be a CH. Here's dredge. Again, you've got your j at the end.
There is a phonological rule that says J cannot be used at the end of a word. So we're always going to check the vowel sound in front and see, do we want a DGE or do we want an GE or GY to represent that J at the end? Interesting enough, some people were asking me one time, why do you have a DGE? Why isn't it just a G? And that's because we need an extra letter protector for this short vowel. If that D was gone, yes, GE would say J, but then you're adding a secondary rule to the silent E at the end. The silent E at the end is going to allow the G to say J, but it's also too close to the vowel. It would change the vowel sound to E, so it would be dreege instead of dredge. So that D is acting as an extra protector so that they don't have the vowel consonant E rule coming in. And that often is some of the reasons why we have certain rules being applied. Okay, if you have any more questions, please let me know, especially as you're looking at through why certain spellings were chosen for certain sound representations and what happens with some of these. Okay, now for some more fun, you have a chance to look at some odd occurrences that happen, especially when we're looking at consonant blends and digraphs within the syllables and the morphemes. Now, there is a weird occurrence that happens in our English language called a maximal onset rule. We'll talk a little bit more about that in chapter 5, but the biggest idea is that we tend to attach consonants to the beginning of the next syllable if we're speaking the syllable instead of where we break it when we're writing it. So this is one of the reasons why when we're talking about syllables from chapter 3, we don't want to find where the syllable is located based on how we say it. That's not how we write it. Now, why do we care? Well, because when we're reading and decoding, we need to look for those syllable patterns because that will help us determine where the written break is, helps us decide what the sound will do, especially the vowel sound. So if I'm looking at this first word and I know that I'm going to be breaking it between the N and the D, then I know that N goes with the A and it makes a short vowel sound. If I broke before the N, then I have an open syllable and my vowel sound will be A. Now, the maximal onset rule messes with this because just like when we said rabbits before, we don't say rab-bits. When we speak, we say ra-bits. And it just pops that B over to the next syllable. So finding the number of syllables is nice to say it, but finding where the syllable break is not, because then it doesn't follow the rules with our spelling constraints and things. So this activity is to help you find where those syllables are. So put a star by the words in which the maximal onset rule applies, and I already did that for you guys here. And then go and do the digraphs, trigraphs, underline the blends, anything like that helps you find out some of the things that make it kind of difficult, like brandish. That's where we would split it according to the printer. And then we have that sh at the end as a digraph or trigraph. That makes it kind of tricky as well. Asphalt, there's that one. Quest, of course, is one syllable. Plenty, we say plenty, but in the brain fart here. Sorry, in the dictionary, you'd actually have plent and then E because Y is its own morpheme. So go ahead and pause and play around with a little bit and see where does that maximal onset. This is when we speak it. That's how the dictionary is and when it messes with it. And other things that make it maybe a little bit more tricky when you're talking about building words with multisyllables and some of these occurrences. Okay, gave you a few pauses to pause it, come back. I'm going to go ahead and click all of them. Again, if you're not sure why some things are marked the way they are, please feel free to ask me and talk to me about why. And we'll talk about some of those fun occurrences that happen. Okay.